Hello, welcome back to Asian Fempreneur. This is your host, Rani Hari. If you are new here, welcome. This is the place where the power of play intersect with spirituality, entrepreneurship, and digital technology. In today's episode, I feel very strongly about this one because in my environment, I've been seeing people with neurodiversity, especially ADHD, starts to coming out or even identify themselves as having those conditions. Well, I don't have that ADHD label, but to be very honest, I can relate with some of the signs there. I've approached Key to be a guest speaker, and because I know that she has actually lots of things, lots of insights to share with us on, especially in regards to how people can view those with neurodiversity better and support them and understanding that it's not them trying to fitting into the system, but hey, like there are more and more people with this condition coming up. So maybe we should start questioning on how we can make the environment a better place that suits all types of people. That's what the topic gonna be about today, as well as her journey being a solopreneur. And you don't want to miss at the end because Key will give us some tips on how to become a better caregiver, as well as for people who have been maybe diagnosed late in their life as ADHD, or even those who feel like they can identify with some of the signs, but not necessarily have that official diagnosis. So, without further ado, let's welcome Key. Welcome to Asian Fempreneur podcast. I'm so grateful that you are here with us today.
Oh, thank you. I am most grateful for this opportunity and looking forward to connecting in this space in this container.
Yeah, and Key here is a friend I've met through DCI, the Dharma Coaching Institute. We do the coaching certification together, and I would say we've passed it. That's it,
Yes,
done.
that's it.
A full-fledged coach now.
Yeah, full-fledged coach. I'm coaching folks every week and on my dharmic path.
For today's conversation, as through the times that we are together, this is something that a topic you're very passionate about and
Yes.
very personal to yourself as well, which is
Hmm.
parenting a neurodiverse child, especially the one with ADHD. And before we get into that itself, this is something that I ask my guests. How does your aligned self look like to you?
My aligned self is me operating with the prioritized values that are aligned with how I view God and how I should be operating in the universe. So, if I'm, as long as I'm operating within within that container, and that means in terms of the boundaries I set with other humans that come into my space, the boundaries that I set for each day. Here's what needs to be accomplished. Here's how I plan to do that. So attitudes and moods are definitely a part of that. But that's how I view it in terms of, how am I operating in my aligned self? That's a daily, it's a daily commitment. It's a daily commitment.
A daily commitment, and I keep hearing setting boundaries as well. How do you know that when something is already beyond your boundary, and is it something that you have to reinforce every day?
Yes, for me, yes. Just because boundary or living with boundaries has been a newer concept for me. It's something I struggled with not knowing most of my adult life up until maybe a decade or no, less than a decade ago, maybe 5 years ago. I didn't realize, oh, that's why, I feel exhausted around certain people. I feel drained in certain situations. It's because I didn't realize that I had the choice to choose, how I showed up in certain spaces and how I wanted to show up. And it was okay that if it didn't work for other people, that it was okay that this is what works for me. And the universe has always has shown me since I've learned that it supports me no matter what human existence might say. Like, oh, she doesn't want to follow these rules, and she's against this. But the universe says, nope, you're honoring yourself, and I'm gonna get you. I have your back no matter what these external forces might say. So that is it has been a daily commitment, and there's times definitely where I veer off on a daily basis, and I'm like, nope, get back on track. It's my sanity and my peace are worth more than gold to me on a daily basis. That's how I know I'm aligned, and I can usually tell if there's a certain body ache. It'll show up in my physical body. It'll show up in my moods, and I have to keep checking. Like, oh, why am I feeling like this? Oh, nope. Let's get this out the way. Let's attack this. Let's get it out. So it is a daily challenge, but it gets easier with time.
So in your case, understanding, like doing this body check, like being aware of where, okay, what's happening, like is something feeling not comfortable here and there. So what triggers it?
Yeah, and I'm usually aware or cognizant of the triggers. What was happening before is, I already knew there were certain relationships or certain people that would be draining to me, but I would still go in and do it anyway because I felt obligated. I felt like, well, this is the right thing to do because society tells you we'll do this anyway. And I had to really get rid of that type of thinking and that type of value. It really was not a value to me. And I realized that I am my best self, and I'm able to be more available to those when I'm aligned with what I'm supposed to be doing and how I'm supposed to be feeling. So it really winds up honoring all parties, even if they don't understand it. In the beginning, it does wind up honoring everyone in the outcome, including myself and my son, which is those are the two most important things to me in terms of my relationships here on Earth.
Mm, I like it. I like it when I hear stories about like what you just tell me, like how you like a moment where you actually realize that, okay, this is not in alignment of who I am, and it's not, just doesn't feel right. And then understanding that uh, we've been basically performing for other people's expectations, or like under conditioning.
Yes.
So like, well done, Yuki.
Well, yeah, and I think one of the things that sparked me or motivated me to make that shift and make it abruptly is when I started seeing those same symptoms in my son, who was really young at the time. We're talking like 5, 6, 7 years old, and I'm like, oh man, he's starting to adopt some of these learned behaviors, because of how he's viewing me or how he's seeing other adults respond in situations. So I felt like I had to do something. I had to make a change because I just did not want to put that on to my son or any other human, by the example that I'm setting. So he was definitely, as I call the lamb that made the lion out of me, to say, you know what, no matter what, I'm going to protect his sanity in his life, even if I've had adopted these behaviors, which are all learned behaviors. It's become very normal with our generation, the older generation, to do as you were told. Children should be seen and not heard, and color inside the lines and do everything. So all those little perceived social societal norms. And that's what we were just following in those footsteps. And then at some point, you got to say, wait a minute, this is what's really real here, what's really important, and how, what is the impact long term of following these societal norms. So yeah, when I started seeing my son exhibiting some of that behavior, it brought me to an abrupt halt almost, and just said, no, the game stops here. I'm changing no matter what.
I like the way you say it, like your son is a lamb that awakens the lion inside you. That is so biblical, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Um so you're a mama lion, I guess.
I am. Yep, a mama lioness. I sure am.
Mama lioness.
Yeah.
Hmm. Okay, coming back with your son, because again, ADHD is something that's I've been encountering even in my own environment as well. And I feel like, okay, this is something that needs to be talked about. And like throughout our interactions, I know how very passionate you are about this. So, um, do you mind telling us, at least based on your research, based on your experience, what is ADHD? What is ADHD and what is it not?
Okay. So, ADHD has been defined at this point as it stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Now, without going on a passionate rant, I kind of have some issues with how we're defining it. I don't know that I would want to necessarily call it a disorder, but I would definitely categorize it as behavior that is against the norm of what we've been used to having to deal with. So that is the medical right now, the medical definition of what ADHD is. Um, as a parent who's kind of grown to embody the condition, if you will, um, I um, I feel like that what it is not, and some of the labels that people will put on it based on the behavioral symptoms of it is it's not deliberate disrespect by a child. Another label is it's not, meaning that a parent is not a proper disciplinarian at home or has a home with no boundaries or no structure. That's definitely another label that gets placed upon parents with ADHD children. It is not necessarily caused by a parent that may have, had a drug issue or something of that nature. Now, it can be, but there are all kind of prejudices that people say, oh, and I have to say that before I had my child, I did that. I was one of those people that would see a parent in the supermarket and say, oh gosh, she's got to get control of that child, and how wrong I was, in some cases, how wrong I was. So, with everything, there's always an exception. And I'm not saying that none of these things apply, but it's generally not. And especially as I've talked with other parents and I commune with other parents who have ADHD children, and I start to see the commonalities. I'm like, okay, so I have my own research that where I see some of the trends. It seemed I had my son at an older age, and I do notice that a lot of the other parents that I tend to run into are have had their children at older ages. And I think current society, that's going to be huge now. People are no longer starting families at 18 and 19, out of high school. Our whole shift has taken place in terms of our society. People are waiting till they have more financial security, till they're more established in their jobs, and actually can take care of a child in the way that promotes a more probable area of success in terms of their human existence. So, because we have that consciousness now, there people are waiting, and saying, "Let me wait till I'm a little bit, better along, so before I bring another life into." So, I think that's one contributor. I think there's also a factor of some of the preservatives and additives that they're adding into food. So, I think nutrition is another huge thing that I've noticed. Even with my own research that I've done, if I give my child a certain food or, might have like a red dye 40 or something like that, how does he react, 20 minutes after having that food? So our food source is different. Our when we have children, our whole family dynamic is different. So there are different things that I feel like that do contribute to, the condition being more widely noticeable than it has in prior generations.
That was a lot. But so okay, I will try remember, because like there's one thing that you said in the a bit in the beginning, that you're a
Mhm.
parent with, I forgot the words, the exact wordings, but it's
Mhm.
something that it sounds like indicating that you may or may not have ADHD itself, if I'm correct in understanding.
I don't know that that was not my intent, but I mean, I do feel like, yeah, there are some there are some things, especially now that I parent an ADHD child, that have exasperated some of the symptoms that I see in my son. Whereas maybe before I had a child, they didn't necessarily, they were more suppressed because I don't have the stress and the pressure that having a child that brings it out. So they were more like subdued. But yes, I don't doubt that I have some of the characteristics, maybe not so much the hyperactivity, but some of the impulsivity, occasionally, especially if I'm bored, some of the inattention. And I just always chalked it up to, well, a lot of people are just boring in this world, because they're just living under this, social norm of what's acceptable and not really tuning into who they really are, because it was not acceptable to be who they were, to be expressive of who they are. So that's how I chalked it up to. Some of it I still feel is true. But we just learn to suppress it, where I think where children with a more severe ADHD really is just not able to suppress it. It's just something that, you can do it through fear, and I'm against raising children out of fear. So that's something I actually am very passionate about. Yes, I can make my child sit still for 30 minutes, by using techniques of, like I said, fear, and intimidation, and you better sit still. Like I'm just against that. I just know that the long-term trauma and damage that it does to someone's emotional state do not they far outweigh what we can deal with right now, and I'm just against that as a whole. That leads into a whole
Hmm.
nother discussion about children, and now we're seeing a lot of the school shootings and children acting out in school and against teachers. And I think some of that is rooted, in some of the trauma with these preconceived, societal norms that children has to act a certain way all these hours a day, and which a lot of it I think is against human nature in itself. But that's not the topic for today. But I can see how it definitely does integrate into that. You know.
Yeah, just a bit of context here for our listeners slash watchers. Um, a key here is from the US. So the experience that Key experience has been mostly US based, especially in terms of, you mentioned shooting as well, which is a very a big topic like that we hear as well, even outside of the US.
So are you saying that you hear about it a lot outside of the U.S., or does it take place, or you're just hearing about it? Like, oh, the U.S. has a lot of school shootings. Like, no, I'm curious.
um,
Like, how is it? I don't ever hear about other
um,
countries having it, so I don't know if it ever takes place there, or you guys just are listening to it. Like, wow, the U.S. has a lot of school shootings going on with kids.
well, that's definitely well, like if there's a headline, not all the time, but like if there's a shooting, especially a big one, it's gonna make a headline, and like it's not just. I mean, people around the world will listen, like, will hear about it, especially if it's like a major headline.
Hmm.
Um, but I guess it's because I have relatives in the US, so I hear that a bit more often than from the national news.
Yes. Okay. It's a real big
Hmm.
problem, and people are trying to solve it by saying, "Oh, do we no longer sell certain types of guns? Do we have certain extra parameters around guns?" And it's a very political issue, controversial, because some people say, "No, we don't want any laws against guns. We should be able to buy guns whenever we want to." And I think right now, my personal opinion is that the U.S. is having a hard time identifying the core of what's creating this. Yes, I know
Hmm.
that guns don't shoot themselves, and I think that we should examine what is creating, what is motivating the children to do that. And it really does boil down to, they're out of alignment somewhere. That's the cause of anything, any dis-ease, anything that is not in order. It's because there's not an alignment somewhere, and figuring out where that alignment roots from and healing it from that way, I think, is a better approach. But it does take more time, and more damage could be done until that is resolved.
Hmm. Is there? Okay, we're a bit digressing here. Is
Okay.
there is there a particular examples you could give us or you could share in when it comes to your child, especially with ADHD, like a turning point, if you may?
Mhm. Well, and I can tie in that last statement. So I was one of the largest symptoms of children that have ADHD are low self-esteem. And it's constantly people are misreading them, they're misunderstanding them. You have it from teachers who are not trained, teachers who were raised, I'm going to say, with, the same way that a lot of old-fashioned people were raised, not understanding and being empathetic to what ADHD is and what it's not. So there's a constant issue of they don't understand me, I'm not seen, I'm not heard, I'm not understood. And that is what I meant. That can lead to a lot of the civil um, outrage that people are seeing. I'm not alluding that everyone that has done a school shooting has ADHD, but I am alluding to, yes, there is something there that is a mental and emotional, usually in alignment. And because ADHD people and children in particularly who don't have a grasp of the full understanding of how the world operates right now, they can suffer to the point where it can cause them to do these things. It does definitely tie in. Their emotional state is a huge issue with children, especially teens and things of that thing, social media and how they're viewed. That definitely does. Like I said, it's another angle of ADHD, but that is a huge symptom of it that people should be aware of. And a lot of teachers who are not sensitive, school systems that are not sensitive to the impacts of classroom management and how to address those children. Those things can definitely and directly lead to a child acting out in extreme measures. As with anyone that is under an extreme amount of stress and low self-esteem, who feels like they're being attacked consistently. So that is a tie-in for that. When I went off on that tangent, it's very important. It's a huge issue here in the U.S., and it probably will be eventually within the rest of the world as well.
Hmm. I wonder here, because you mentioned, I think like the key word here is low self esteem. Like
Hmm.
so you were saying that especially people who have ADHD, like the issue is that they have low self esteem.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's one of the largest symptoms of, that they suffer from, which is
Mm.
understandable. They're living in a world that doesn't understand you, that misreads you. They think that you're being disrespectful when you're really not. You're just being yourself, and it's constant.
Mm.
It's every relationship, every environment you go into, so I do feel even when talking with other parents, a lot of them tend to be isolated or at least with environments at home, so for me, the first few years, our backyard, investing in things to play at home or around, or a setting where I can control the environment a little bit more. Those were huge for me, because it's too exhausting to have to keep going out in public and saying, oh, even going to a park sometimes. If for other parents that don't understand, like your son keeps doing this on the slide, I get it. Yes, he does. He's not a bad child and he's not going to hurt anyone intentionally. But yeah, he does have these set of challenges. And once I explain that and they can see, okay, this parent is not just letting him do whatever he wants. It's not due to lack of discipline. There's just a misfire there in the brain. And when they understand that that's where it's coming from, then people usually take a step back or take a pause and say, let me reframe how I am looking at this child or how I'm approaching this situation.
Hmm. When I'm curious, Key, when's the first time when you realized that like
My son
your son
has
has ADHD?
It actually, I didn't realize it, which was very frustrating until later. When he was at 3 years old, he had a very good, experienced preschool teacher, and this teacher had been teaching for almost 40 years. So I trusted her. She has taught, thousands and thousands of kids, and she said, oh, I noticed that, Quest, this is my son's name, he's extra fidgety. He has a hard time. At that time, they're introducing circle time and seeing if all the other kids can sit down and listen to a story. And she noticed that it was particularly challenging for him and like there's usually about two or three others that fall in that same category out of a whole classroom. So she mentioned it. but it's hard at that age because a lot of the what they call ages and stages or age appropriate behavior is, yeah, 3 year they're toddlers. They can be a little extra moving, some, a little bit more
Mm.
difficult than others. So they really don't tell you, they're not going to give you a diagnosis that early. Even with when he turned 4, he had another teacher, because you don't have the same teacher the whole time, which makes it more of a challenge. So now you're having to learn that teacher's having to learn you and kind of seeing where you are with your boundaries and how you like to run your household and what your priorities are. And then, the 4-year-old teacher, no, she was different. She did not have as much experience. She had a military
Mm.
background, so it kept showing up for her as he doesn't listen, or he doesn't have the discipline. And I said, wait a minute now, because we have a very routine home. It's not like I let him hang out all night. We don't hang out hardly at all, but it's very structured. And I'm a very engaged parent, so I knew that's not, it wasn't a bad behavior, but again, it's a prime example of what I knew I was going to have to deal with from here on in. I could tell how she
Mm.
was raised, and I can tell what her value system was. And I'm like, okay, military background as a daycare, probably not a good match. but well, not a good match for how I value things. If you want to raise a
Mm.
robot that says sit still for 10 minutes and do this and do this exactly, then okay. And there's some parents who really do want that. I don't. Just because I've been able to study and see what the long-term impacts of raising kids does, because especially as a life coach, a spiritual life coach, kids who've had that start breaking down around 25, 30, 35 years old. And they're saying, wait a minute, why is life so, there's such a void here. There's so many things that's not adding up. And it's because of that militant and, um, I would just say it because of that approach to parenting. And I don't blame anyone.
Mm.
That's how we've over the generations. That's how we were told. That's how you're supposed to do. Kids have to learn this. Let's have to do this. Everyone has to fit into this little box so that we can all work together. And that's not true. And in fact, it showed a lot of damage emotionally, and because you can't see it, and they do call ADHD the invisible, the invisible disorder. You can't see that their brains are not misfiring on the right hand side or the left hand side, because you can have both. ADHD can mean the left side of your brain is super strong, which means the right side is not as strong, or it can mean the left side of the brain is super strong and there's deficiencies in the right side. So they actually have, it's both. And with the right side, you might see kids who do very well academically, but maybe emotionally is how it may show up for them. Verse and it's very, I've seen all types of variations, but do you know that's what it is? There is definitely a neurological pattern that takes place that causes the behavior that you might see in these children. So long story
Okay.
short, they did not
Mm-hmm.
diagnose him until kindergarten. To answer your question, they
Hmm.
did not formally diagnose him in kindergarten. They said, okay, by the time he was 5 years old, he should have been able to sit into circle time, and he was repeatedly showing that he wasn't able to do that for a long extended period of time. He should have been able to. He had difficulty transitioning to different tasks. So on top of ADHD, my son also has challenges with executive functioning, which I didn't know that until last year, maybe. Because it's just not enough information. There's no one that sits down with you, including your primary, your pediatrician. They don't even, I've done more research on it than a lot of the doctors I've met with or people I've talked with to try to get help for him. It's just exhausting for parents, because it is a newer diagnosis. I think it's only been around in terms of ADHD, maybe 25 years. So it's
Mm.
not a condition that was acknowledged in prior generations, which makes me want to cry for all those kids that had it and the parents just, people didn't know how to deal with them. But yes, so that he didn't get diagnosed, so he was in the tail end of kindergarten. And even then I thought, okay, they're going to put probes on his brain. Is that how they diagnose it? Do they see like how he thinks? And no, not that at all. It's actually very subjective. They did like a 10-page interview questions for teachers in his life, for other school staff in his life, for parents and other family members, people who are around him a majority of his waking hours. And based on those interview questions, they get compiled, and then the pediatrician and or the school psychologist in some cases. His school didn't have a psychologist at that time, but the pediatrician can make a decision to say, okay, yes, he has categorized ADHD. Then you have to make the choice if you want to be medicated or not. So kindergarten, if the symptoms are showing strongly, is about the time where it can be diagnosed. But I kept being told, no, that's not ADHD. He's just a boy. He just has extra energy. People don't understand boys, especially brown boys, because that has been a label in the African American culture here in the United States, that brown boys tend to have extra energy. And I think it all goes to the connotation, oh, they're athletic and they have this and it's that. Oh, he'll grow out of it. So, I get mixed signals. I'm like, do I pursue this as ADHD? Do I sit back? Because I feel like, well, there's things I could have done earlier had someone been very clear with me. But I had people who were professionals like, no, that's not ADHD. He's just being a boy and his teacher's ultra sensitive and she doesn't get it, so it's very, very frustrating.
Wow. I mean, okay, that's gonna be coming to the next question, which is about the challenge, because you already mentioned about the experience with the daycare teacher who came from a military background,
Mhm.
as well as there's bias even from experts or like the authority figures that are supposed to actually dig deeper, which again, it's just reinforced the importance of doing your own research, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So
And knowing
I
your
mean,
child.
and knowing your child as well,
Yeah.
because again, at the end of the day, you're the parent and that's your child, so who else supposed to know better?
Right, which is and that was part of my challenge with corporate America, because of the role that I had. I mean, I was working very long hours, and I felt, in hindsight, I feel terrible. I'm dropping my son off at 7 o'clock in the morning, and sometimes I wouldn't pick him up till 7 o'clock at night. And here he is navigating this world really by himself, 12 hours a day. Around most of the adults that were around him were certainly not trained with ADHD, and half of them were not empathetic individuals. Because with the school systems here, it's really hard. Teachers have been a challenge to have teachers, let alone trained teachers. And even if you're not trained, then some people, most teachers in the past have had that natural nurturing, that natural empathic way of being. And those teachers have gotten it. Like they could see it right away. And they're like, oh, yeah, I can see how to deal with him. And they don't even have to have a certification. But a lot of people who are, educators now don't have to have that I call it that nurturing, that empathy gene. And they're just, like, nope, I'm here to teach a subject. I will go over the book and whoever gets it should be getting it. And to me, it requires more than that.
Is that I would say, since you talk about your experience being in corporate America and then like you had to drop your child by around 7 a.m., is that also one of the challenges you face? Like, because I imagine here, correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine that you have to spend like not just 5 hours. I imagine there would be time for like overwork, right?
I mean, yes. And in the role I had, because I was managing a team of people, it didn't stop. It was like I get on my cell phone text messages or, hey, this update's getting ready to come tomorrow. So be prepared, so that meant I have to log back on, after reading books before bed, bath time, dinner time. And then, so it was just a lot, and I felt like I had to, it was, I say this, and as a single parent in particular, I mean, that's another thing to notice. It's not like I had another parent in the household or another adult in the household to say, hey, can you take care of dinner while I handle some work stuff? Can you handle bath time? No, I was doing it all, it is too much. And unfortunately, my son was compromised, because of that, because really I should have been looking at him. And I did. I mean, I've considered myself a more engaged parent than the norm, which was important to me. But I started noticing a sadness to him, even at 5, even at 4, and that concerned me. And he was just like, he kept saying things like, I'm too fast. I don't fit in. The teacher doesn't like me. So for him to start saying that language, and I know that even though I was busy, the environment that we had at home was full of love, full of acceptance. And so for him to start, when I started hearing that language and I saw his behavior change, I knew, all right, the world's getting to him. And I'm not going to let this world, just because they're ignorant, get to my son to a point where just doing permanent emotional damage without him understanding. The world's going to do some damage to any of us. That's just the world we live in. However, with his young mind and his young ability to be able to discern the different types of adults, and I had to have had difficult conversations with him saying, Quest, every adult is not right. Just because someone's grown up does not mean they're right. And most of the people who I coach now, it's because of something that happened to them in their childhood where an adult was irresponsible, or an adult was just downright wrong. And so, we have this cultural perception that once you're an adult, the adult was always right. You always hear that, like, you listen to your adults, obey adults. And I'm not saying to be disrespectful, but I did need to put it in perspective to protect his self-esteem, so that if a teacher was telling him, Quest, you're wrong because you can't sit still, I'm saying, no, that adult was wrong for telling you that, and how irresponsible of them. And I had to let him know and get him empowered to say that adult was wrong. I'm happy that you noticed it. And I almost gave him a challenge of saying, let me know what other times you see it being noticed. So that empowered him to say, oh, Mom, I met another adult that did, that wasn't responsible. And so, like, she told me to do this, and I told her I had ADHD, and she still was telling me to do this. And I said, no, that's not how I can operate. So I had to, like, almost put the shift back on him, so he understood the problem is not necessarily him himself, because he's not a problem. The problem is the world not being able to be identify it, and B, adjust their norms to being empathetic toward it. That's really what it is. That's why I don't call it a disorder. I call it more of it's a disadvantage, not a disorder. And the reason why it's a disadvantage is because most people are not trained on how to embrace it or how to work around it. Like any other disadvantage situation. If somebody is born with one leg, if somebody's in a wheelchair, if somebody is missing an eye, we make all these little, these things to kind of, help us, help them, and help us to have a society built around to make it feasible for all of us. Whereas ADHD, because it's hidden, you can't see the misfires taking place. All that's inward, you can't see it. So people think, oh no, it's just him acting up. I'm like, no, it's not. It's not just that. So that's how I've coped with that early on in his diagnosis, and empowering him is protecting his heart, protecting his esteem.
We see the mama lioness here. Like, nope, that's it. Like, I got to do something.
Right. Because I'm not going to have one of these kids. He's not going to be a school shooter. He's not going to grow up with all these anger issues that were unresolved, because I'm not allowing him to stuff that inside and internalize, just because other adults who were not sensitized and not conscious enough to check themselves on it. I'm not doing that. Nope, not my child.
Yeah. And I like also the way you say it's not a disorder, but it's actually more of a disadvantage, because I feel like the attitude, at least in the modern medicine attitude, is more like it's a disorder, so we gotta cure it with,
Right.
let's say, drugs or medications in general. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but that's the perception I got.
Yeah,
And I
absolutely.
sense that this is not gonna be something that's curable, just like you drink medicine for some time and then, okay, I'm cured, I'm normal now. But it's more like it's a situation, it's a condition that
It's a condition.
it's a disadvantage, as you say, and
Yeah.
we need to be more aware of, more cognizant of, again, the neurodiversity of the people around us. Not everybody operates the same, like normal. Like, what is normal anyway?
Right. Oh gosh, don't get me started on that. But you're absolutely right. I totally I concur with you 100%. And I think until we shift as adults, until we shift our thinking to that, is it a condition? I mean, is it a disorder, or is it, it's a condition that someone has, and we make all of these adjustments for other conditions. It's just that a lot of the other conditions are more visible. Someone can see when someone's in a wheelchair. Someone can see, if there's a speech impediment. Someone can see if they're blind. It's a very obvious thing to see. Okay, I see why we had to build a ramp here, because people down here have, wheelchairs. I see why we have to have braille on every train in different things, because a lot of blind people have to access that. Those are all things that we have put in place in our society to make it more inclusive, for people with different conditions. The ADHD condition is very, very difficult to pinpoint, because if you don't know somebody and they're with their kid, then you might think, oh gosh, this is just another parent that did not discipline, that has no structure. They let their kid just run wild and do whatever they want. Like I said, I was one of those people who had that. I had those thoughts in my head when I would see certain situations. And so, it is hard, and because those symptoms are similar to that same symptom, it's hard to know, is this ADHD, or is it just, an unstructured home environment, that's taking place, or is this mental illness in a child that has not been, diagnosed, or is not being attended to, because it shows up like that as well. So it's a very difficult, condition to have, because it's so misjudged and so mislabeled and confused with other symptoms that look like that's not a condition. And like I said, if you could open up and see the brain and see if there's a misfire versus a kid just acting out because they're used to getting whatever they want, then it would be a lot easier to say, oh, I see the difference now.
Mm.
It's subject to a lot of judgment.
When you said if we can open and see the inside, it makes me imagine this like a glass like thing where you can see the working of, say, a clock or something, and you can see the
Robot,
cogs.
right? Right.
Yeah.
Because in all the videos and all the trainings I've been to, I'm like, that's, when it shows like how like one side is lit up and the other one's not, and I'm like, oh, that's so obvious. I can see why he's acting like this when but I took that visual, for me to see that, and really until we have a society, which is probably emerging right now, where, either we have probes, and then it can like maybe give a signal to, like, when you're walking down the street, like, oh, this person has ADHD, this part's going off right here. There probably will be something like that, in the near future, but until that happens, it's going to be very unclear, and it's all, subjective in terms of who has it.
And going back to yourself, Kay, since you're now an entrepreneur and this podcast is about entrepreneurship as well, so I wonder what's the turning point? Like, I mean, I suspect there, like, your child's condition is a turning point of what makes the shift from corporate America to solopreneurship, but, like, please let me know.
I didn't know that I was going to be a solopreneur, but I just knew that I had to find a way where I wasn't just sending him out all the hours around, amongst the wolves, as I call them. Not bad people, but just wolves, people who don't understand him. And so, it evolved. It was like one step after another. I took one training, and then I actually had a reading done, like a psychic reading, who told me, oh no, you're going to be doing this. So, I mean, it wasn't just like one, lightning bolt moment. It was like baby steps. And it almost was like, here's where I'm going to bring you to here, in terms of God, the universe, whatever people, however they want to refer it to. It was almost like, a step-by-step leading. And then I realized, oh, this is what I'm meant to do. Even through some of the journal prompts I had earlier on in life, 10 years ago, some of my journal prompts, and revealed to me now, I'm like, oh my goodness, that was Spirit's way of even showing me or preparing me that this is what I was going to morph into, over time. So it is a spiritual journey, with my son just helped bring it out even more. Um, the solopreneur, yes, it has its challenges, but this is what I'm meant to be, and I am of the belief that every person, every human that is brought to earth is brought here with a purpose. And I think that takes a long time for some people to digest. Some people have different belief systems, were raised with different belief systems, but once I studied God enough in his nature and the nature of God, I realized, nope, we're all brought here for a reason. And it is part of our job to find out what that is and to cultivate it and to carry it out. That's what we're here to do. And when we do that, then life can be lived with a relative amount of enjoyment and fulfillment. It's not always going to be fun, but it can be fulfilling to say, okay, if I'm doing the work that I was called here to do, then the universe, God puts everything else, that all the other supports in place so that it can be done, so that I can maintain this. Because we are ultimately here to serve others, was what I came to. So once I came to those conclusions, and I had the other trainings I was always in, I've always been a lifelong student or in pursuit of trying to figure out how to live this life the best way, based on what we're here to do. And it just all it was an involvement. So one step in front of the other, and it took a whole lot of courage, a whole lot of faith, planning, execution, and it took a huge amount of trusting in who I am, identifying who I was, and trusting in that process. And that trust came from, I didn't create me, but the most powerful thing in this world and universe created me. And so because they did that, they will bring it to fruition. They have the ability to put everything in place so that everything I need and most of my desires come to fruition. So it started with a prayer. Based on a mama who was noticing, I'm stopping this right now at 3, 4, and 5. When I see my son looking like he's sad, or people are not understanding him, I'm like, nope, we're not going to be another one that just goes down in the books. This mama's going to put up a fight, not just for my child, but other children. Like I said, every classroom I notice, if my son wasn't taking nap time, they're like, your son doesn't like to do nap time. I'm like, well, there's usually 2 others that don't either. So what is you as a school going to do with those kids? Don't force him to have nap time. He's not tired. You know what I mean? And then he'd be up all night. So but the school, it's a disadvantage for the school, because like, well, the teachers can't have all, their lunchtime when he doesn't go to sleep. Sorry, if I'm paying you thousands of dollars a month to watch my child, that's your problem, not his, and don't make it mine. And that's the problem, that it's like have to constantly check adults to say who's right here. If I'm paying you, yeah, every kid doesn't want to have a nap time at the time that you want them to, and they shouldn't have to. You have to put things in place. That's your job. Right. So yes, hence my journey.
Okay, yeah, like this is why I like hearing your stories. So you're full of zest, you're full of energy, like so passionate about it.
I'm like, how dare they? How dare adults think just because they're an adult, and it's their company, that everything has to fit a certain way. And I'm like, no, you don't fit a certain way either. It's just that maybe your way is not as obvious, or you suppress it. That's on you.
Speaking about suppression here, like coming back to the very beginning, what are the things that you notice about yourself that it may come because you were suppressing it before, but now you start to notice it because you're parenting someone? I wonder what are those things, if you don't mind me asking.
No, I don't mind you asking. So I think the things that stand out the most in terms of a shift, was how I approached schoolwork and expectations of, like homework and grades. One of the society, and I know this is pretty much across the board. Most societies say, "Oh, we reward children," and reward systems. So I'll put it that way: how am I rewarding my child, and what am I rewarding them for? In this society, and I'm sure, like I mentioned in others, you get rewarded for good grades, you get rewarded for good behavior, you get rewarded for basically you're rewarded for appeasing the conveniences of the adults that you're around. And I'm
Mm.
like, I made me stop and say, again, how arrogant of adults to think that, these little kids who showed up in their purest way possible are have to get rewarded based on what makes you comfortable. And I am against that. Now, I'm not saying that they don't have to learn how to be in a general structure. Yes, we're in a giant world together. It's a whole lot of us. So you do have to have a reasonable amount so that we can all speak the same language, and we have to know how to act in certain. I get that, and I'm not negating that. But when it gets to like report cards or behavior cards, so I did make that adjustment. I don't say, before I was like, well, did you do 3 hours of homework last night so that you could get it? So a big shift for me was in thinking I'm going to have to do everything within my power to compensate to help my son to learn this lesson. So we'll say, for instance, with reading, that was a very big challenge for my son. He loved books the whole time he was in preschool. The whole time, I mean, I would read to him 2 and 3 times a day. The whole time he was in my womb, I read him books. I read to him even when I was expecting him.
Mm.
I love reading. And it broke my heart when I realized that when the shift came to for him to be expected to be reading, I was like, oh, he's not able to do it so much. And so I had to shift chose to how I chose my approach in that. So I didn't want to be
Mm.
forceful, whereas I always thought I would be. I always thought I was like, okay, these are the expectations. We're going to learn how to read no matter what. And I knew that reading was going to happen, but it was like how long and at what expense. So I had to shift. I think my discipline, my expectation. I didn't want to be that parent that just shoved a bunch of rules and expectations down somebody's throat. And yes, they'll learn it. Yes, I can get him to be a straight A student according
Mm.
to these norms, but then I can also do a hell of a lot of emotional damage on the way that will show up, in 10, 20, 30 years from now. And then they're going to be like, well, why are you like this? It's probably because some adult tried to shove the education system down his throat before he was ready. The
Mm.
other thing with my son is developmentally, he's about 2 or 3 years, about 2.5 years behind in terms of what is considered normal ages and stages at his age. So I said, why would I shove this down his throat now? And in 2 years, he can just probably easily transition and say, oh, okay, that's a much easier transition for him emotionally and me. Not having to yell and sit down and force and stay up all night and you're going to get this till it's done right. That's just there's like, why would I do that when I know that developmentally he can catch up and it'd be a much easier transition for him to learn this if I just wait another year or so. I'll introduce them, I'll keep feeding that seed along the way, but then, when he's ready, when his brain is ready to get it, he'll just get it, without all the drama, without all the stress. So that is the one thing that shifted for me, making that choice, saying, how do I want him to learn? What's my what is the most important thing? His emotional state of being and his spiritual state of being are the most important things to me, period. Because I know those are the things that are eternal in terms of spiritual life, and the spiritual is going to be tied at this point into emotions. So I
Mm.
protect those at any expense. Eternally, no one's going to be caring about ABC. No one's going to be asking you about your timetables. No one's going to ask you what your title was at work. No one cares about what letters you have to after your name. All that means nothing, when you're looking at the eternal existence that we are. It can help, and I'm not saying you're not going to learn those things, but why go out of your way to create so much damage when it doesn't have to be that way? When
Ooh.
there's another way to do it.
What came up to me is that an image of you, based on what you've told me just now, it's like you're a filter, basically. You're filtering what goes, like what the
Mm,
outside world wants to say to, like, or yeah, wants to say to your child, and you are like filtering, like
yes,
what information is necessary for him right now and what's not.
absolutely. Yep. Yeah, and I've had a lot. I mean, it hurts. I step on a lot of toes of teachers and school staff. I mean, this year alone. And it's not that I'm being rude. It's not that I'm being, like, just, I'm not bitter. But it's none of that. But you're basically having, I spend a lot of my life hours as it relates to him trying to educate adults on how off their thinking is and how off their approach is, not because of who they are personally, but because of how we've done things for generations. It's just been off. And it makes me want to, like I mentioned, it makes me want to cry when I think of all the people who have ADHD 100 years ago, who had ADHD 50 years ago. Nobody knew what it was. They just said, oh, this kid just never got it right. And even men that I have personally dealt with, in close relationships, men and the men who would say, I never understood. My mom said I was just hard headed. I just don't understand why I couldn't do right. And I could tell with all earnesty, it wasn't like they were trying to do that. They just couldn't cope. And I said, that's probably a form of ADHD that nobody knew about, nobody knew how to handle. And the emotional damage that I have seen take place with all those people who are now 40, 50, I'm like, their life didn't have to be that way. Had the adults in their life taken a little more empathy, taken a little more time to say, wait a minute, no, I know this kid intimately, and he's not a bad kid. I'm around him enough to know that his intentions are not bad. There's something that's making him not sit still. There's something that's making him not, read like everybody else. And that's not their fault. That's not their fault. But so yes, that's where that comes from.
Okay, we're gonna talk about family here. Like, you came from a Black
Okay.
American family. I'm trying to
Been a
rephrase
challenge.
the challenge. Like, basically, how does your family being helpful, or maybe you wish like it could be better if they can do it a different way? Is there something like that when it comes to supporting you
Absolutely.
and your child?
Hmm. Yes, and I think the story with Black American culture, and really is the same or very similar in all American culture because, like I said, that parent I've been at the park. I talk with other parents, and I've gotten so good at it now where I can spot that child out right away. I'm like, oh, that one, he's somewhere on the spectrum. Oh, I see another one. I don't point him out physically, but in my head, I'm like, oh, I can tell he's yeah. And so as in talking with other parents on and there's usually multi diverse. We're around all kind of cultures, Hispanic, Asian, you name it. We're around a lot of people, and I'm starting to see it is everywhere. But like African American or Black cultural families, there is a perceived I think the prejudices are one. People think, okay, that they're being disrespectful because respect is a huge thing, and probably because we've had such a history of oppression and not being respected. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with all the Black Lives Matter. Hearing that's rooted, in terms of in our DNA. I think for long term oppression, long term I call it postpartum slavery and just how we were viewed in the world as being less than. And because of that, people tend to, Black culture says, oh, respect and discipline is a must, for Black adults. Because there were so many years where Black adults were not respected. They weren't even seen as human. I think 3/5 of a human is what we were looked at in America society, that Black people were only 3/5 of a human. That's almost comparable to cattle. um, yeah, so that's how it was with Black. Yes, when you talk about slavery evolving from an American culture, we were looked at as 3/5 of a person until they changed the law years and years later to say, oh, we are fully human now. And that's why when you hear the expression Black Lives Matter, it doesn't mean that no other lives matter. It just means we actually matter as a human now, whereas before we weren't really looked at as being fully human and fully mattering as every other human that exists. So that's kind of the concept of that. And because of that, and understanding that cultural significance, discipline and respect, especially, has been, very sore points in Black culture raising their family. So when I've had people, Black culture, Black people tell me, "Oh, your son, he doesn't sit still," or he didn't say, he's disrespectful because, I told him to do this twice and he acted like he didn't hear me. And I'm like, he probably didn't hear you, for one. I mean, he literally does not hear until sometimes you say that the third or fourth time. And I had to learn that, because I was like, Quest, I just told you to do this. And he was like, Mom, I promise I heard you say that, but somehow I just didn't, my body wouldn't like act. And he wasn't playing games. Like I can tell when he's earnest. And so that's how I knew, again, by spending that quality time with my child, what is him being earnest versus what his excuses for behavior. But yes, that is probably the biggest thing in terms of which my culture can support children like these. It is very prevalent, and when you don't, uh, the spankings and the discipline that they put on children to say, oh, you didn't sit still, I'm just going to spank you till you sit still, or you're going to be on punishment until you learn how to do this, and I think it's abuse. I really do. I think it's a form of abuse, and it's not just Black cultures. I see it in every cultures, Hispanic, Asian. It just really depends upon the family member and what they allow. What they allow, and I'm not allowing that. So if anyone is trying to say, "Well, I put him on punishment," and I'm like, "For what?" If they say, "Well, he wasn't listening," and I have to remind them, let me let you know that this is one of the symptoms of ADHD. And now I know my son's nature, and he is a people pleaser, which I'm going to have to undo that as he gets older. He aims to make adults happy. He is so nice to other people. So anything, knowing that about his character, I know that he would not intentionally not listen to somebody. So if someone says, well, yeah, I put him on punishment for listening, and I'm like, that doesn't sound like my son. Like if he didn't listen, it's because he didn't really hear you or his attention was somewhere else. So don't discipline him for things that he can't help right now. You can let him know that's how it made you feel, but you don't put him in trouble for something that he can't control. Just like I wouldn't punish an adult or tell them to go to jail for something that they may not physically be able to do, or they weren't born with a set of traits that the rest of us have. So that's probably the biggest things I see in culture. But as more and more African American culture is experiencing ADHD, which I'm seeing that a whole lot more. That's probably because a lot of the women who in this culture are realizing that we have suffered so much in prior generations with not having enough resources financially, because we weren't given the same employment opportunities, and so we have this fear of struggle. That is deeply rooted, that's deeply rooted. Struggle, strife, it's hard to make ends meet, not being able to take care of our families the way that we know they deserve to be taken care of. And so women are waiting later in life. They're getting their careers established. They're making sure, they have their homes purchased or they have a certain amount of money in the bank. And so, it's almost like have all these things in place first before you have kids. Now, so that's what we're doing now. Is before it wasn't like that. It was like, nope, you're out of high school, trying to start your family. Women don't work; they stay at home, they take care of the home, and it was just a different shift in that. So because women are waiting to have families later, we are starting to see more and more have ADHD. And there's other things as well. That's not the only thing, but I do feel like having children later in life has been a commonality that has been blaringly clear to me. I'm like, okay, I see she had her child close to 40. This one had her child close to 40. There are other things that can cause it as well, but that's what's been, in my experience, has stood out a lot when women are having children later on in life.
Okay, so what you're saying is that there may or may not be a relationship between a woman having children later down, like a bit later in the life, with the child being having an ADHD condition. Is that what you're saying?
That is correct. Yeah, yeah. Because I'm not saying that every woman that has a child at 40 has it,
Yeah.
but I'm just saying I do notice when I talk with the other parents at the park, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I had my son at 38," and I'm like, "Oh yeah, me too." And so versus there might be other parents who are like, "Oh yeah, I'm 25," or I have my son at 30 or something like that. Just a big that is one thing I noticed. But it could have, like I said, I also think that diet and nutrition is a huge factor. Though, whatever they're putting into our food now that they didn't have years ago is, I think, is a huge factor that there's been some research on it, But I think that has a lot to do with it. So you could have someone who's 45, and maybe they have great nutrition practices and their child comes out fine, so you can't, it's not a label where you can say, this is, I just noticing trends based on my personal experience and my observations. But I think nutrition is a huge part of it. Age has a big part of it. I don't know what happens to our bodies at a certain time frame. Maybe it changes chemically inside, that might promote that. Um, and yeah, so
Mm-hmm.
that's been my two things I feel like are
Mm.
huge indicators.
Yeah, I mean, I can comment a bit on that. I mean, based on the biology lesson I did like maybe more than 10 years ago, even more. Um, yeah,
Mhm.
it is say that like older women, like as like beyond the age of 30, like it's the chance of the baby being having, let's say, like conditions
High risk.
increase.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. So that part, like it sounds, at least it sounds concurrent with what you just said. So yeah, I mean, it's possible.
Hmm.
And I love our conversation, Ki. I feel like we can go forever on and on. Um, okay, be, I'm just conscious of the time as well. But before we end, though, like there's something that I have to ask you, and especially
Sure.
as a mama lioness who are feeling very strongly
Hmm.
protective of your child, as well as someone who has seen like what sort of value, what sort of tradition that used to be there, and now it just doesn't seem to be working anymore, but yet it's still being implemented. So I wonder if you could give, like, say, some sort of tips for a fellow moms or even dads out there that is having to take care someone, let's say a child or
Yeah.
someone in their care with ADHD. What would
Yeah.
you say to them? That's number one.
As a caregiver, and that could be anybody, I think it's important to identify your value system, identify how you want to approach it. I even want to deal with this huge thing and identify your approach. What's your value system? What do you want for your child? What is most important for your child based on your priorities? And then find the resources. There's lots of disjointed, but there are still resources online. There are online parenting classes. I mean, there's so many organizations I have joined. Child Mind Institute. There's ADHD. There's so many. And now there's probably more research now than there was I've ever seen in the past 5 years. There was hardly anything. I kept asking my doctor, what else outside of medication? I mean, is there like a certain therapist that can help strengthen these areas, or, what exercises can be done at home to help strengthen the other sides? And there's certain sports they tell them, like I have my son in piano because I played piano and I could tell he naturally played piano as well. That helps left side, right side brain kind of balance. That's really what it's about. It's about balancing the brain, so that the left side and the right side kind of function at an equal level. So certain sports, gymnastics, really, again, it's all about balancing. What sides are you using? So, but I would say that for um, a more spiritual approach, or a longevity approach, figure out what your value system is, and then stick to it until you see it needs to adjust. Don't let certain authority figures, and I don't know who's calling them authority, but whatever. Don't let certain authority figures, no matter if it's your family, no matter if it's, I don't care if someone has a PhD in something, challenge that. You know your child and you make the time to know your child. Don't let this society make you work so damn much that you can't even have an intimate that you don't have intimate clarity of how your child is. I think that is one of the biggest disservices that we do. Everyone's so big on, oh, I gotta work more so I can have this bigger house, so I can have this better car, so I can have this better lifestyle. And the whole time we're working and the more we're away from our kids, the less the more injustice that we're doing to them. I felt like, gosh, it's not worth it. And it's not. You can't. Someone's only a child one time. You only have a few years to put some of these things in place so that we're not raising another generation of matured children. That's what a lot of adults are right now. They're mature, because their bodies are mature physically, but in their minds and their emotions, just underdeveloped. And because you can't see it until you're either in relationship with these people or you're working with them, then it starts coming out like, okay, this person responded this way, not so mature. And that's why they're saying that like EIQ, which is emotional intelligence, is now the new thing to strive for. No longer just regular IQ, which I've always believed that IQ is, subjective. But EIQ, emotional intelligence, Daniel Goleman has a book on it, and he was featured in Oprah, and now he's featured everywhere. But that is what we should strive for. That empathy gene, that being able to see how you are in the world and how you impact your emotions, impact those around you. And, when the education system and other people, other authority figures in our life start showing that as a value system, then I definitely feel like that we will have a shift in how the world plays out. But as a parent, yeah, do your own research, know your own child, know what works for you and your boundaries, and stand by it. Stand by it. And self-care. Self-care. Take care of you. You're taking care of so much other stuff. Being a parent of an ADHD or a caregiver of ADHD requires so much extra from an adult. It really does. It's so much extra energy, so much covering, like before someone, having to pre-think and plan, oh, we're going to this park. Oh, I know over here, these kind of parents hang out or these kids hang out. That's probably not best for him right now. In honoring what works best for your child, even if that means you have to sacrifice. And it will mean that. A lot of parents don't want to be like, oh, I really want to go here. Okay, you want to go there, but that doesn't work for your child. So guess what? You cancel your plan. Stop being so selfish, but do self-care, that works for your child, that you're getting nourished and your child is getting what they need, at least while they're a child. That's my advice. Those are my tidbits that I can think of that were really important and vital.
Okay, just to recap, so like understanding your value, and then challenge the authority and get to know like your child and yourself, especially when it comes to boundaries, as well as self-care. And that self-care means something that works for, I realize that you said something that works for your child more rather than it works for yourself. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And I know that sounds a little awkward, but self-care. So I will give you an example. One thing that, especially when my child was younger and I had an issue with childcare, because when you have an ADHD child, it's not like everyone's raising their hand and say, oh, please let me babysit your child. No, it requires extra effort. So childcare is an issue for those caregivers, and it just requires too much. It requires a lot of energy, a lot of planning, preparing. And it's like, is it even worth it for me to go through all of this just to leave my child somewhere for 2 hours so I can get a breather? So I had to I built my was like my staycation. I did things. I invested in a hot tub in my backyard. I invested in doing things that brought me joy, that were at home. So I'm not saying that has to be, you have to have a fortress and you can't ever go anywhere. But I knew that, the time that I could do self-care responsibly was probably when my son was sleeping, or he had another act on the TV for 5 and 6 hours either. That's not productive. Does it require more energy? It does. But again, they're a child one time. You only have a few years to build this thing, and make it a productive human, from the get-go, from the start. So yeah, I made things at home. I didn't get to go to the hair salon that often. It's different from when you have a 2-parent household where you guys can tag team. But in my case, I was a single parent. And so, going to the hair salon meant, oh, that's going to take 4 or 5 hours. That means I have to drop him off at this person's house, find childcare. A lot of times when I pick my child back up, it's like, oh, I can tell an incident happened because, I could see dry tears here. I can see the person who was babysitting look like, whew, That's a lot of work. And I'm like, okay, which made me feel guilty about even leaving him in the first place. He's stressed out, and the person who was babysitting seemed like, they were happy to get to say goodbye. Was it worth it just so that my hair was done? And I'm just like, probably not. I'm not saying that my hair doesn't need to be tended to, but what can I do as a compromise so that it's not causing all those impacts with all those other people? So self-care is important, and I'm not saying put yourself last, but self-care that is a compromise that works for the greater good. Even if it's saying
Mm.
I'll do this for the first 10 years until my child can get a better footing for themselves. And you have to be willing to do that. A lot of people are
Mhm.
selfish. They say, oh, I want to travel. I want to go to Hawaii. I want to go here. And yeah, everyone wants to do that for the most part. But if it doesn't work for your child, you're going to have to be able to say, I'll do this after this certain time frame, unless you have certain support systems that you can do that responsibly. And the main support system is, who are you leaving your child with, and for how long, and how is your child gonna feel in their care? Is it really worth you having some fun time,
Mhm.
over, somebody else being distressed, or your child being, maybe even being traumatized? It's not worth
Mm.
it to me.
So finding a solution, finding a self-care solution where, like, yes, you have to make a compromise, but like the one that is less damage to the surround, like to all parties.
Right.
Okay.
Absolutely. So my self-care was maybe
Okay.
not have been things that I was super excited about, but and it's something that would lessen the probability of my son experiencing trauma.
Hmm. Okay. So that's number one. Thank you for sharing that, Key. And this is the last one. What tips or
Okay.
anything you would like to say to those adults, young adults who have just been recently or maybe been diagnosed as a ADHD, or maybe even like a blanket ADHD? Like, what would you say to them?
Can you explain to me a little bit more what you mean by blanket ADHD?
Blanket ADHD. I mean, it's just a term that I would say someone who may or may not like they exhibit some signs, but like they can
Oh, okay.
identify, but
Okay.
they don't get, like they don't have that official diagnosis yet.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I would say there are a lot of adults walking around that probably should have that diagnosis. What it has led to, and one of the reasons why I love the calling of being a spiritual life coach, is because I can approach these people and say, look, I understand how you must feel. You've been told you're a circle that has been told to fit inside of a square box your whole life. And you can play it game, you can morph into a square, but eventually your circleness, your edges, your roundness has got to just get out. You can't suppress that. It shows up. And I think that's what adults now didn't expect to happen. You just can't suppress for that long. It does come out, and you do whatever, be relentless in figuring it out, what it is you're supposed to do. Be relentless, because you are created for a reason. And the reason that you're created, God gave you all of the attributes that you have to carry it out. That ADHD means you might have the extra energy. You might have the ability to focus on something so tedious and so minute, and you can do it for hours. I mean, there's all kind of strengths. You might have the capacity to be more sensitized and feel things at a deeper level. So all of those strengths, there's a reason why you were created the way that you were. And it's not a bad thing. It just means that the people that this society has not learned how to embrace it, identify it, and figure out the right niche for it. But you do have a path, and you don't have to live life frustrated. You don't have to live life frustrated. That's what I would want to leave with them. There is a way. There is another way.
That's such a beautiful thing to say, Keith. Thank you very much. How can our listener, watcher, connect with you?
The best way to connect with me at this point is through my email. Um, and that is fruition, Fruition, quest, QUEST at gmail.com. Again, that's fruition quest at gmail.com. Quest, which also is the name of my son.
For those who are listening, you can email Key on the on the email. I'll put it on the show note below. And I would like to say thank you very much, Key, for this very insightful discussion about parenting a child with ADHD, and especially how we as an adult can reflect on how it, like, what's been working and what's not working right now. So thank you very much, Kay.
Thank you. This has been a healing opportunity for me to express so many years of work in this as being a parent. So I appreciate this opportunity. And I will leave with a quote that my dad gave to me as I was expecting. And he said, "Become the parent you would want to raise your own children. Become the person you would want to raise your child." And I thought, oh gosh, what if I was, if I was having, if I had a child right now and something happened to me, who would I want my son to be left with? I want them to have the best person possible, somebody that's has everything in alignment to make their life thrive. So I leave that with the audience to say, what gaps are there? Do you feel like you have that you could close so that you could be the best person to either raise the children that you have now, and it's never too late, or to raise your children to come?
Such a beautiful words, Kay. Bless your father.
Yes. Yes, he has many, many words of potency. Well, thank you so much for your time, Ronnie.
Thank you very much as well, Key. And yes, that's it for today, guys. And thank you for tuning in. And I will see you in the next episode.